Yesterday's meeting of the full cabinet saw 25 ministers weigh in on the end state of Britain's relationship with the EU. Yeah, I bet you wish you were there. Me too. But with a renewed warning this week from the EU chief Brexit negotiator, he's called Michel Barnier, that the UK couldn't have a bespoke deal, his words, after Brexit, it hasn't become much clearer how things will look at the end of the process. Today he said that the EU is aiming for any transition deal to end before December the 31st, 2020, which is interesting because that's less than 2 years after the official day of the UK's departure in March 2019. So what exactly are the current models and what does the British government want? Our Ellie is here to explain.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, the hardest or cleanest break would be no free trade deal with the EU. The UK would trade under World Trade Organization rules and tariffs could be imposed on exports to the EU. The UK would be outside the single market, outside the customs union, end free movement of people, pay no ongoing EU contributions, but be free to make its own free trade deals with other countries. A similar situation to Turkey would see the UK outside the single market, but in a customs union with the EU in some sectors, although there'd be no payments and no free movement. Switzerland is outside the customs union and most of the single market, but pays some money into the EU, accepts free movement and accepts EU standards across more than 100 bilateral deals. The much talked about Norway model would see the UK as a member of the EEA, accepting all 4 freedoms of the EU single market, but outside the customs union. The Canada-EU deal, also known as CETA, was long in the making. It's considered an example for the EU as it significantly reduces tariffs and some non-tariff barriers, while not obliging Canada to be a member of the single market or customs union, accept free movement or pay into the budget. But crucially, the Canada deal doesn't make it easy to trade in financial services, a major component of the British economy. That's why the British government has continued to insist on a deep and special partnership, reflecting the nature of the UK's economy and the fact it's starting off in alignment with EU regulations. David Davis labelled such a model as Canada plus, but the viability of that option won't be clear before leaders of the EU 27 decide on their opening position in March. Well, this morning, Michel Barnier has been speaking. He said that the UK's red lines meant the final deal would take on a roughly familiar shape.
All of these different models could strike a balance between benefits and obligations, and cross-checking that with the United Kingdom's red lines, own red lines, then, logically, for the economic side of our partnership, we'll be working on the basis of a free trade agreement, along the same lines as what we negotiated and signed most recently with Canada, also South Korea and Japan, even more recently.
Well, that's Michel Barnier. We'll hear a lot more from him next year when stage 2 of the negotiations get going on Britain's departure from the European Union. We're now joined by a man we hear from all the time these days. We sent him to Brussels to try and hear less, but he's never off the screens. Adam Fleming. Adam, good to see you there. Now, it would seem from what Mr Barnier is saying and what's being said in London from the government that it is a free trade deal we're looking at. There's going to be an argument over what kind of free trade deal, but it's a free trade deal.
Yeah, I think it's now the 47th time I've heard Michel Barnier say something along these lines in the last 6 weeks. He's been going on and on and on about it. And his theory is this, which is if you take the UK's red lines, so no membership of the single market, no membership of the customs union, and no jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice after the transition period, that all adds up to the best the UK can be given by the EU is a free trade agreement along the lines of the FTA, as they call it, signed with Canada, South Korea, and Japan. And the way he sums it up, as you heard in that clip, was it's about the balance between the obligations and the benefits. So if you don't take the obligation of, say, free movement of people, then that limits the benefits that the EU will offer you in return. And that is the reasoning behind a PowerPoint slide that Michel Barnier has been showing to all and sundry, showing the different models that you get with the EU up here, a free trade deal down here, everything else in the middle matched to how it means that the red lines mean that the UK can't have that. So that's what he's going on about there.
Now, I saw that PowerPoint. I did think it was a little bit confusing, but I'm more confused, Adam, by why Mr. Barnier continues to repeat himself and lay out this kind of bargaining position. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is the Council of Europe, which represents all the heads of state of the other 27, hasn't yet given him his marching orders. Is that right?
Yes, so the timeline is this. So the European leaders did their second set of guidelines, which they issued last Friday after their summit, saying, you know what, we can start pretty quickly on a transition. The document that Michel Barnier was launching today was the more detailed version of the negotiating directives for that. That will be approved by ministers at the end of January next year. So the actual detailed face-to-face talks with David Davis and his team on the transition can start at the end of January, beginning of February. Then what the EU wants is Mrs. May and her cabinet colleagues to have that big discussion and set out more detail about what they want about the shape of the future relationship after 2019, after the transition period. And only in March will EU leaders at their next big summit publish, yes, another set of guidelines, another document, which will be Michel Barnier's more detailed marching orders for negotiating the shape of the future relationship. And it's worth just reminding ourselves what Michel Barnier said about that. He said at the end of all of this, on Brexit Day in March 2019, there will be a big withdrawal agreement, a treaty, which will have a political agreement attached to that, which will talk about the shape of the future relationship, the framework and the jargon on trade and economic matters, but also cooperation on security, defence, foreign policy, aviation and other bilateral areas. So he was saying, yet again, the final free trade agreement, whatever that actually ends up looking like, once all these discussions have been had, that will come at the end of the transition period. The best the British government can get during the Article 50 2 years of Brexit negotiations is the withdrawal treaty plus a political declaration about roughly what the future will look like.
All right, Adam, sound like there's plenty to keep you busy in the new year. I hope you're going to get a good break over Christmas. Adam Fleming there in Brussels joining us. We had hoped to speak to someone from the European Parliament to try and get more of a steer on what Mr. Barnier was saying from their perspective, but we've been let down at the last minute, but not by our two guests. Let me start with Claire Perry. What do you make of Michel Barnier saying that the British won't get a bespoke trade deal?
I think he's doing what the EU team have always done, which is get out and have highly publicised statements about what they think is the right starting negotiating position. And then, as we saw with the deal shape of the breakthrough arguments and deals that we had last week, we end up in a very different place. And I think that Adam's point is absolutely right. And you made the point, Andrew, that the power of national parliaments really now starts to come to bear, because we know, again, with things like the auto industry, there are huge interest in certain countries in making sure we have the closest possible trade alignment. So I think the strategy of coming together as to the position in government, which is this point of maximum alignment in 2019 and then controlled divergence, is the right one. But I think this is now all up for negotiation, which is why it's going to be an interesting year next year.
It is likely to be negotiating bluster, isn't it, on Mr. Barnier's part? I mean, Japan has a bespoke trade deal. Canada has just secured a bespoke trade deal. Covers some services as well, contrary to what some people have said. South Korea has a bespoke trade deal. Why wouldn't Brussels give its single biggest trading partner a bespoke trade deal with whom it runs a massive surplus?
Yes. Well, you've got to hope that's where we're going to end up. But I think what we're seeing at the moment is a sense of frustration from the EU that all we're hearing from the UK is what they don't want, not really what they do want. And to me, it's astonishing that it was only yesterday, 6 months after the election, that the Cabinet actually sat down and discussed for the first time what the vision should be for when we leave the EU. I mean, we've really got to get that sorted before we can move on with these negotiations.
When will we get the government's position?
Well, we've had it all the way along. So we've had the Lancaster speech, the policy papers, the Florence speech, the first shape of the deal. I mean, but again, there is a chicken and egg here. Until you have agreed, and of course all of these conversations have been going on for months, and I can't believe that the shape of the trade deal hasn't influenced some of the conversations. It's a game of of moving forward. The idea is the EU says that nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. I think it's probably not.
But we're about to enter those parts of the negotiations where we discuss our future relationship.
Exactly.
With the EU, and it will include many things, as Adam was saying, but above all, it will include trade, trade in goods and services.
The most important thing, yep.
So in what way does the government want it to differ from the existing arrangements for trade and services?
Well, we want to have the deepest, closest possible relationship whilst not being part of the single market, because we cannot sign up to the free movement of labour and the jurisdiction of the ECJ.
So what will you give up then?
Well, this becomes a negotiation, doesn't it?
Well, what sort of things then will you give up?
There are sectors like the auto sector and the chemical sector where there is a strong desire from industry for very strong regulatory alignment. There are other sectors potentially where that is not so essential.
But you just mentioned divergence. Are we going to diverge from the EU over time, or are we going to shadow it?
Well, again, that to me is a decision for the cabinet and a decision for the negotiations, because you can see if we want to do better in agriculture, if we want to have an agricultural support system in the UK that does more for the environment, for example, that actually increases support going to family and mixed farms rather than thousands of acres estates, then we need to diverge from the EU in order to deliver that. That seems to me to be a legitimate point of discussion.
But is the government's position that basically on trade and services we want things to stay as they are?
No, the point is we start from a position of convergence, which is great because it's easy to negotiate.
So I'm trying to work out what it is you're going to give up to be able to get out of the obligations of free movement and the European Court.
And that is part of the negotiation.
I know, but I'm trying to ask you, what is the government's position?
Well, the position is that there will be sectors where we think that it is important to maintain that as close as possible regulatory environment because of the importance of this cross-border trade and the supply trade that supports the plants in Justin's constituency. And there'll be other areas where there will be other free trade opportunities that are more attractive. And remember, the whole point of doing this is so that we can preserve as much as possible of that relationship, but still have the freedom to do other trade deals. As you said, that is the situation that Canada and South Korea and Japan are in.
Well, actually, they're all in different positions.
Well, they're all in different, exactly, but they're in bespoke
positions.
positions, is the point.
That was the point I made. If Mr. Barnier is saying we can't even have a bespoke trade deal, well, that, as we say, may be a bargaining position, but if he's saying that, what hope does Labour then have of keeping as members of the single market and the customs union, which I understand is your latest party's policy? He's not going to agree to that, is he?
No, well, our position is that we want access to the benefits of the customs market and single...
But everybody has access.
Even
North Korea has access.
It's about having unfettered access without barriers and
But you can't have unfettered access unless you meet the conditions of membership.
Well, that's why we need a bespoke deal. That's why we need to get on with the negotiations. We need to give clarity and the transition.
Well, clarity would be great from anybody these days. I'd give that from, I'd like to have that from Labour or Conservative.
Oh, no, that's not fair. Look, come on. 2 months ago, we didn't have clarity on the size of the divorce bill.
No, I'm not talking about that now. I'm moving on to the trade talk. I'm looking forward. But I want to try and
we've reached clarity.
Well, you're not going to give me clarity, are you?
But we've reached clarity on areas where people thought we would not be able to reach agreement.
Will there be any tariffs on any goods?
For negotiation.
Right, so there's no clarity. Will services be included in the final deal?
That, I assume, is a massively important ask for the negotiations, given how important they are to the economy.
I come back again to the point.
I'm not leading the negotiating team.
No, but we're only a couple of weeks away from the new year when it starts. Can you give any indication of any major European figure that is prepared to have us stay as members of the single market and members of the customs union without meeting all the obligations that go with that? Has anybody indicated they would agree?
No, we wouldn't be members. It would be about having access, and that is the important thing, because we want to make sure that our industries and our jobs are protected, and that means that we have to have very favourable trading arrangements. And
But why
don't you vote with us then, Justin? We want the same thing.
Well, we also want Parliament to have a say on these things.
We do too.
You're giving the government
Let's not get it. I was trying to get to the substance. Let's not get to the process. In fact, I think we'll leave it there.